Next, we have Stephanie Rieger. Stephanie is someone whom I have admired for many years. Some of the seminal work that she's done out of Yibu, stuff with myriad devices before most of us were brave enough to really dive into the mobile web world. She was doing it. So Stephanie's going to talk to us today. She came all the way from Scotland. Not only that, the interesting thing is she's not going back. She's actually moving to Vancouver, BC via Responsive Field Day. How cool is that? So I want to turn it over to Stephanie so she can talk about the physical web.
Got a password on it.
Ah.
We secure it.
Oh, right. Right. Okay, so not as smooth as we would have liked, but that's okay. Hi. This is a presentation that we've been working on for a little while now. And this is actually kind of a preview, kind of a super early preview of a longer presentation. And because of the format here of only the 20 minutes, we've had to kind of cut it down. But it's also an opportunity, hopefully, to see what everyone thinks. And so we would really, really super appreciate feedback, either on Twitter or anybody who wants to basically comments, feedback, insults, whatever. There's a lot of new ideas in here, and we'd love to know what everybody thinks about them. So yeah, this is all new stuff. So, let's see if this clicker starts to work. Here we go. So, I believe, I'm increasingly believing anyways, that one of the reasons that we keep debating whether the web is maybe or maybe not dying is that maybe we aren't completely certain yet how to use it to its full potential. Which, you know, it seems a little bit strange because it's been around for about 25 years, but these things take time sometimes. And humans are actually historically pretty rubbish at figuring out the potential of technologies and how they're actually going to fit into our lives. You know, poor Tim did not have a good reception to the first kind of prototypes of the web necessarily. And there's a long history of this. I mean, we just generally, we invent new things. We don't really know what we're going to do with them. Oh, sorry, I'm using someone else's clicker, and it's a bit more sensitive than what I'm used to. So another really interesting example, let's say we were in the 1900s right now, we'd probably all be sitting in a big room talking about electric motors and how what we really, really would need is for each person in every house to have one electric motor. And what people thought we would do, basically, is that electric motors would be this thing. You would have one of them, and you would carry it around your house, and then you would plug it into things. And all of a sudden, these things that were relatively inert or maybe not so smart before would get that much smarter because of the electric motor. And of course, this is completely not what ended up happening. But it still feels sometimes like that's the way we look at the web. Even though many things have changed over the years, it's still kind of something that we're bolting on to either a product or a business or a process or something that we're doing, rather than thinking of it as something that could just completely, you know, drive it and enhance it and then totally disrupt it and completely change it. So what I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes is the possibilities and the opportunities that are going to hopefully emerge with something called the physical web. Now, the physical web is an initiative that was started about 2 years ago by one of the designers at Google. So it's just an initiative at the moment, but it's actually been moving quite quickly. And the goal really is to create an open standard that will extend the web that we currently have and allow it to kind of seep into the physical world. And so, I mean, you know, needless to say, this is going to change a lot of things. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is, as part of this discussion today, and hopefully a lot more discussions, is to consider, you know, what the web and the browser and kind of the ecosystems, the standards that we've built around them, what are they really for? What are they going to be good for? I mean, what are they good for now? We kind of think we know that, but not just today. You know, what will they be good for in the future? Because maybe we're still at that kind of, you know, a motor for every home kind of stage with the web, right? Where it hasn't quite found where it's going to sit, and the uses and the behaviors that will actually really define it are coming a little bit later. So let's kick on with some more stuff about the physical web. The reason why Scott started the project, and he just finds it really well in this quote here, right? So his basic thesis was this, is that the number of smart devices, and we're not just talking laptops, we're talking, you know, smart fridges and toasters and all these various things, they're just going to explode. And the assumption that each new device will require its own application, it just isn't realistic. It's just not going to scale. So what we need is a system that lets anyone just interact with a device at any time And it's not really, it's not about replacing apps. There's still a place for apps in some of these relationships, but it's about enabling all sorts of really new interactions when native apps just aren't practical. And that's what we're trying to do with the physical web, is allow anyone to just walk up to something and start interacting with it, the way we do with the browser, right? But with physical things. So how's this going to work? The technology is actually, at a conceptual level, it's actually fairly simple. There's 2 bits to it. So the first bit is you have a wirelessly broadcast URL, so a URL that's being kind of flinged out wirelessly into the world. You've got a device that's doing that. And on the other side, you have software on a person's device, usually a phone or a tablet or so on, that will detect that URL and display it, and it'll do that when the user is interested and ready and wants to do it. And that's a really key part, right? The user is always in control. Like with the browser right now, if you don't want to use the web, you don't use the web. Well, this is kind of the same thing. You could have 100 things in this room that are broadcasting URLs. If you're not interested, doesn't matter. They don't bother you, they don't fling notifications at you, they don't harass you, they don't track where you are, they don't do anything. It's really, you're engaging with them, you're kind of pulling the information in when you want it, when you want to engage with it, and then you walk away and do something else. So that's a really, really key part of it. It's kind of mirroring a lot of the things that we think of as the values of the web. So the things that broadcast the URLs at the moment, most often there's something called a beacon. This is an example of a beacon by a company called Estimote. It's about the size of my fist, and you just kind of stick it on a wall. It's got a little coin battery in it. Can last anywhere from like a few months to a few years, depending on how you use it. And it just flings out this data basically using Bluetooth LE, which is the kind of low power version. It's a new lower power version of the Bluetooth that we're used to when we're connecting laptops and stuff like that. And low power is important because, again, you put it up on a wall and you just kind of leave it alone. It's supposed to last for a really long time. So that's just one beacon, but some of them, they're getting really small. About the smallest I've seen so far right now is about the size of like a Ritz cracker, right? It's really thin, really small. So they're going to vary. They're going to be all over the place. The other thing, though, that's what's kind of more interesting is that at the base level, this is really just a technology that we want to embed into other things. So rather than stick a beacon on something, there's also going to be lots of scenarios where you just build this capability in. This ability to broadcast URLs just comes with all sorts of other things. And then other times you might still stick a beacon on something because you just want to add that capability yourself. So we're going to be creating basically this big ecosystem of things that are broadcasting. And then on the other side, what you want is a big ecosystem of things that are listening, right? So these devices, they need software that listens. And right now, that software is a native app. It's basically a prototype proof of concept that was made by Scott's team at Google. But the intent, really, is to get this into the browser, right? The browsers that we know, Firefox, Chrome, you name it, new browsers that don't even exist yet, that's really the plan. And that will, hopefully spawn all sorts of interesting stuff. So how could this browser-based discovery kind of stuff work, right? So how are you going to experience all of this? These are all kind of hypothetical concepts. We've been working on some ideas of how it might work kind of from a product perspective, but we haven't spoken to search engineers, so I'm sure if you were a search engineer right now, you might look at some of this and go, this is completely crazy, it's not going to work that way. But this is part of what we're trying to do, is also engage people. We want to, start discussing this because it's really important to how we're going to experience all of this, is for the whole community to get involved and start talking about it. So, first scenario, really low-hanging fruit. What's the first thing you could do, right? So you've got people, they're in a big room, and there's all these beacons, you don't know how to access them. So the easiest thing to do in some ways would be to kind of politely sneak the beacons in to the browser. So when you open your browser, you've got your home screen, and if there happen to be beacons around, it says, look, you've got a couple beacons here, and you can just kind of interact with them, or you can leave them alone. Again, the idea is not to push people to interact if they don't want to. That's kind of the easiest way to do it, to start off, right? Now, next, of course, this is still browser, there's a search engine, people are going to want to search. So in theory, what you could do is let people type in a search term, but then you start displaying it in different categories. So, we're used to seeing web and maps and images and stuff like that now, and this would just be a new category that does that. And there would be some challenges at the beginning. You could be in a room and you type in sushi, and there's absolutely no beacons that have anything to do with sushi, and so you end up with empty results, which we're not used to. We're not used to anything being empty on the web anymore. So that could be kind of interesting, but in some ways that's the whole job of the search engines, to figure out how to enhance this for people. The other thing that will probably start to happen is we're going to want to actually kind of personalize and make it a bit more, increase the productivity. I mean, right now our relationship with the browser is, we have bookmarks and we've got a few productivity features, but we don't quite use the browser in an intensive personal way. Whereas here, you might have your house full of devices, and each of these has a beacon. You're going to have beacons that are actually really important to you because you interact with them a lot. You'll have others that you really don't want to see at all because maybe they came with like, I don't know, your boiler, and it's not something you're ever going to interact with. So you might want to favorite some of them to make sure they always show up really quickly, and actually mute others so that they don't show up at all, and filter and sort. So a lot of different interactions that we're not used to at the moment. And then finally, I mean, the results I've been showing so far, if I go back here, right? Whoops. Sorry, this remote is really sensitive. So a lot of these results have been really simple. It's just like a title and a URL, and that's kind of it, really. But for this to get really interesting, what you ideally would want is for the search engines to start saying, okay, well, look, I mean, these are URLs that they're broadcasting. The URLs go up to the internet. There's web pages up there. Some of those web pages are probably known already. They exist. They've been indexed. There's data related to them. There's a knowledge graph, social graph. There's all this metadata that's already on the web, right? So start to pour that back into the results. So even though you've discovered the thing in the physical world, there's probably a lot of virtual bits of data that you can pour back into the results to make them that much more meaningful for people. Now, so far we've been talking about browsers and search kind of the way we know it. You got lists and things that you pick, right? But maybe we're still being a bit too conservative. I mean, this is completely new, right? How else could this work? Could the browser be different in some way, right? So, a few little ideas. This is a wireless or wearable device, and it's been designed for the Pokemon Go game. And what it does is it glows and it vibrates, and it has a couple different behaviors when you're walking around in the real world and you encounter something that matches the virtual world thing of Pokemon. It kind of notifies you, and then ideally you're supposed to interact in some way. So I think this is kind of a neat parallel of what are other ways that we could encounter things in the real world and actually have notifications or have different ways to discover things that completely deviate from our usual thing of let's look at a list and pick some results, right? And another little example that I found was kind of interesting. This is an artist by the name of Neil Harbison. Now he can't see color. And he's an artist, he's a bit of a hacker, and so what he ended up doing is he found a doctor who was willing to implant this antenna on his head. And at the end of the antenna, there's a sensor that actually converts color frequencies into sound. So what he effectively can do now is, he basically, you get these audible frequencies that are assigned to any color that's around him, and he can hear things. He can hear color. He can go and stand in front of a painting, and he can hear it. And then because he's an artist, he turns that around, and he also paints what he hears in color the other way around, right? So, I mean, I think the browser could fundamentally change if we really want to think of it in a very different way, and the way we discover stuff potentially could. It's just a matter of figuring out what do we want this to be, right? And again, browsers are great because everyone can make one if they really want to. A lot of this stuff is open source. You could have really conventional browsers, and you could have interesting little single-use browsers that do something completely different. So, you've found some beacons and you've got your list of stuff. So what happens when you click, right? So why would you even want to click? What are you going to get? So there's 3 key scenarios that people have been talking about so far, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. So the first one is kind of, again, low-hanging fruit, simplest thing you can possibly do, which is you're kind of making like a smarter QR code, right? So what you're basically doing, you've got this guy here, he's got a beacon attached to his board somewhere, and it's flinging out this URL. It says, hey, we've got lovely Middle Eastern food, right? That's it. That's all it does. Nothing more complicated. And so on the one hand, you're like, okay, but we can do this already, right? We can do this. You can type the URL. You could Google it. You could do whatever, right? One of the big differences here is that all of a sudden you've got this issue of kind of scale and reach that you didn't have before. Right, so I mean, if you've got a beacon at the front of this area here, and you've got all these big people in the queue, the people at the back, they can get the same information as people in the front, right? And that's something we haven't fundamentally been able to do with things like RFID, QR codes, or physical URLs that might be written somewhere on a poster. It just doesn't work that way. So all of a sudden we have this reach. The next thing we have is we have the knowledge that the person is actually nearby. And this is an actual location. We can't track them. We don't know really where they are, but we know they're close, right? And that allows us to augment the content potentially in interesting ways to suit the location and, to suit the fact that you also probably know that they're there right now. Now this last bit about them being right now brings up some interesting questions, right? So with mobile, we often have this kind of debate about all these things that mobile users will not want to do. And there used to be this big list. Mobile users will not want to do this, this, and this. And of course, mobile users wanted to do all of that stuff, right? So we kind of have a potential similar issue here, right? So let's say you discover a URL in the real world, and then you bookmark it, and then you go home, and then you access it again. I mean, the URL is on the web. You can access it from anywhere, but you've discovered it in one spot, and then you're accessing it from somewhere else, right? So is there going to be anything that users will not want to do with a URL they might have found in the real world, but then they want to use somewhere else? And how will this impact how we build stuff, right? I mean, and as you start thinking of URLs that maybe control physical things, right? Like, so like I'm controlling this laptop maybe with a URL from my phone over there, but then I take the URL and I go to Paris, and then I start trying to control the same laptop from over there, right? It sets up these really crazy scenarios that we've just never had to think about really too much before. So because we're talking about URLs, again, they're hosted on the web, the content is already up there. You could actually be delivering all this stuff already, but now you're saying, okay, we're going to augment it with proximity a little bit. It then brings up the question of what is this content that you've got there to begin with, right? So should these URLs that you're broadcasting, should they actually be any different than the ones you already have on the web? Are you going to make a whole new physical website and you're going to point the URLs to that? Or are we just going to repurpose what we have already, but just discover it in different ways? So, I mean, this is still, it's probably going to be up for debate in a whole bunch of different ways. But I think what's interesting to note is that people, Walmart, actually, the team at Walmart is probably a good example, and hopefully I'm correct in saying this, is a lot of places that have a physical location, what they inevitably end up doing is they somehow mirror their physical kind of internal information architecture of the store itself into the virtual architecture of the website. There's parallels. There's parallels in terms of departments and floors and things where you send people, and the content is sometimes organized in similar ways. And this potentially could just provide you with a new way to expose this, right? But it's probably analogies that you're already making because your content, your products, and so on, your services are already arranged in a certain way. Other times you might want to do just the opposite, right? So in the physical space, you might have tons of stuff, but you actually only maybe have 2 beacons because you really want to focus people on 1 or 2 really, really important things. And then once they're on their device and they've gotten to the website, then they can look at the granularity. So on the web, you might have the huge, expansive catalog. But when they're in the physical space, you really want them to just only notice 1 or 2 things and kind of engage them in those key things. So you can kind of flip it around. Really, you can use beacons to kind of provide breadth or actually focus it down. The other things you can do is you can potentially assign URLs to things that will never be normally on the web, right? I mean, a person can have a beacon, and there can just be this, one page that refers to that person. It doesn't fit into the architecture of the regular website. You'd never find it there. And maybe that's okay because it only serves the purpose of discovery in the real world and interaction in the real world, but technically it's still part of your website. So I think there's a lot of interesting ways to think about whether the physical web could play a role in visualizing the relationships between the physical and the virtual. And then what is the role of a browser in all of this, right? Could browsers compete to deliver really novel or intuitive or interesting ways to expose these relationships, different ways to search, ways that are maybe more visual rather than, again, a list, right? And another thing that's probably worth considering is we often talk, especially with mobile, there's been a recurring theme of letting go of control of the interface, letting go of control of what you design versus what the user is going to do. And that the best designs, sometimes they kind of set the stage and then they stop short of actually defining the experience so people can do it for themselves. And I think there's a real opportunity with the physical web that discovery services might help people in some ways create their own little series of, it's kind of hard to explain this in some ways, but basically, do you even need to go to a website at all, right? So we've got this scenario where we've got a beacon on each of these alpacas. And so, the farmer goes into the field and he pulls up his browser. He doesn't actually have to do anything. He can see there's 6 beacons, so there's 6 alpacas. So he knows he's missing an alpaca. He knows which ones he's missing because he's not on the list. That's it, job done, no website. You don't have to do anything more than that, right? So all of a sudden, it just completely switches our relationship, but maybe that's okay. And so how could browsers and these services actually help people do that? I mean, maybe you don't have to ever go to a website for some of these types of interactions. We've never had to worry about that before. Well, actually, Google sometimes wants us to do that, is never go to the website. But it's always been in the benefit of the search engines. It's not necessarily been to the benefit of people, always. So that was interaction number one, which is just flinging out URLs, and then you just go to the web, and that's all there is to it. Number two is to actually interact with things using the web. And just to give you a really quick primer, because if you don't work in kind of the IoT smart device space, you might not completely understand how things currently work. Things often look very smart, but they're actually not that smart. So at the moment, if you've got, let's say you've got your phone and you're trying to control, let's call it a smart toaster or something, you're actually very rarely talking to the toaster itself. In a lot of cases, you're actually speaking to an intermediary. And this is just the way technology is right now. We don't have all the protocols and everything in place to actually do direct interaction really well. So what often ends up happening is you can communicate with this extra little bridge. So what ends up happening is you've got your phone, and you send a command, and it goes up to the internet, and it goes back down to a little bridge-type device. In the case of these smart lights, it's this little round thing. That thing's connected to the internet, so it gets the command, and then it sends the command to the lamp. And then some of the lamps can even send commands to other lamps if they're too far from the bridge for the bridge to actually talk to them. So it does this combination of using the cloud as a proxy back down to the devices, and then sometimes they talk to each other. And it's a really complicated way of doing it right now, but it actually enables all sorts of things. Because at the moment, it's really hard for me to just directly talk to a device. The tech isn't really in place to do that yet. So if you extend this over to do it to the web, right? I mean, by extending these patterns over, we could create all sorts of rich interactions that don't necessarily require a device to really be all that smart, but that would allow people to just kind of walk up to devices and start doing things with them using really minimal amounts of smarts. And you could create all these really nice scenarios that, again, normally right now, these scenarios require an app. You have to have the app in advance, you have to know you need to have it, you have to have downloaded it, but you could just walk up to something and have these little quick interactions. And it starts to really question, what's the meaning of the word smart? What's the meaning of the word device? You're in a coffee shop and there's a beacon and you open it up and it says, hi, we're playing this song right now. The next song we're going to play is this. How about you vote the song up or down? Really quick interaction, kind of fun, low commitment. You don't have to do much with it. All of a sudden, you've given somebody something to engage with. And, what is the smart device in that? Is it the shop? Is it the device? I don't really know. It's all these new little things that we haven't been able to do before. But because it's web-based, you can actually experiment a lot more quickly. A really nice example, I saw something similar to this that doesn't use beacons, but it almost could, right, is using the web to progressively enhance other services. And so the example here is that Air Canada, a while ago, they got rid of all their seatback displays, all their entertainment displays, and their entire system is now a web app, and it's served from within the airplane. Basically, the plane serves the app to people who are inside the plane using Wi-Fi. And you just open your device, and it doesn't matter what device you're on, and you get the entertainment system, you can engage with it, you don't have to download anything in advance, you don't have to know anything, really. If you do have the app, then you actually get premium stuff, you get to see Game of Thrones and things like that. So it's this great kind of level of progressively enhancing the service, where absolutely everybody gets an experience, whether you're a frequent flyer or you just got there. And then if you know the company better and you've got the app and you're really engaged, then maybe you have a few more services. So one of the things that's really interesting here is that a lot of these interfaces we've been talking about, they're so situational and they're so one-time that they have barely anything to do with the stuff that might be on the brand's website already. They're single purpose, they can maybe be smaller, they're more lightweight, and because they're almost always engaged with on mobile, then it does call into question whether they could maybe be mobile only. So, instead of delivering this giant multi-purpose container full of stuff, right, all you're doing is you're interacting with this flower pot. Do you need much more than just a tiny little record set? Are you ever going to need more? So you can focus on crafting these really small, carefully curated bundles of experience that tell a really great story because you kind of know the context of the story an awful lot better. And so if you think about some of the stuff that's been happening with Facebook and how they're saying that the web is too heavy and whatever, right? So in some ways, you're crafting much better ads, but it's actually really content because your context is so much clearer. And there's actually some precedent of some of this stuff already starting to happen in China. They have something called light apps that they're starting to design. And they're tiny and they're really beautiful. They've got beautiful design, SVG, CSS, animations, all this stuff, right? And the reason they can make them so small and so amazing is that they're used and discovered just in time. They don't have beacons serving it out yet, but they use QR codes extensively. So you scan a code, you get this beautiful little site in a specific context, and it is so mobile focused that they don't even bother to support the desktop. They just don't even do it because they know it's going to go from mobile to mobile to mobile to mobile, and that's all they're going to do. And one of the reasons also that this is happening specifically in those markets is that a lot of interactions are happening within messaging applications. So, you've got actual interactions, actual transactions, they're all within the chat window, and mobile web leads into it, and then sometimes it goes back out, and mobile web leads back out into other interactions. So, if we start mirroring some of this, it does lead to the question, how long before actually optimizing for the desktop becomes a bit of a liability, where you're actually better off supporting people entirely on mobile because it's the most reliable way to engage and to attract, because it's in the moment, just in time, you know where they are, you know what they're doing. Really nice quote from some people in publishing who are worried about this quite a bit, because publishing, obviously, they're starting to lose a lot of their audiences. Websites are potentially unnecessary vestiges of a time before there were much better ways to find things to look at on your computer and your phone. And note that the word here is websites. I mean, messaging might be eating websites, but I don't think it necessarily has to eat the web. I think we maybe just need to start rethinking what a website is, right? Does it have to be a site? Can it just be little bundles of content that suit the moment? One last scenario and then I'm done. This last one is really short because the technology is really, really new, and that will be finally being able to actually control a thing, maybe not this thing, but something that's smarter than this using your device. No internet in between whatsoever, just peer-to-peer. So there's a JavaScript Bluetooth API that's in the works. There's already some good early prototypes, and basically it allows you to have direct interaction with an object using Bluetooth. And there are some demos on the web. This one from Google is probably one of the better ones, and it shows a really simple interface. Again, this interface doesn't have to be anything more than what it needs to interact with that toy. And it's just talking back and forth, and you press the buttons and the toy reacts. And it's entirely peer-to-peer. So last remaining thoughts, right? All of these examples, some of them are neat, and then some of them are probably like, yeah, but we could kind of do this before. I don't know, this is extra tech. Why do we need this extra tech in the middle, right? But when you take it as a whole, you've got this vast, long tail where you're going to be able to, anything will be able to offer information, utility, interactivity, and it's not just going to be virtual, it'll be tied to the physical world, and there's a lot of really neat things we're going to be able to do with that. These technologies, they're being developed as we speak. The physical web project is open. You can contribute to the conversation. You can contribute code. You can do all sorts of stuff. There's lots of opportunities to get involved, and it's really important that we start talking about it because physical discovery isn't new. There's been actually lots of different things in the past that we've done with Bluetooth. There's iBeacon from Apple. There's a lot of stakeholders and kind of interpretations that are already floating around of what this thing can and maybe should be, and what relationships that we maybe could develop with data, with location, with presence, with privacy in the physical space. And I think the web has an opportunity to do this differently, right? To keep the values of the web in place. So it's our opportunity to get involved and shape those goals and values for the physical web and make sure it's the platform that we want it to be. So if we get this right, hopefully we'll not only build a better web, but hopefully a better world as well. So thank you very much.